column, I can see why there's this sort of car collision in your mind of, why won't he write the way I'm used to reading?
Yeah, I think newspaper articles are written at fifth grade reading comprehension level.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
That's
but
right.
I always say, yeah, this ain't Harry Potter.
Yeah,
This ain't
and
Harry Potter.
it also becomes clear, not just from the use of words, but from the topics that he addresses, that part of what's going on with him is that he's trying to deal with the problem nobody else wants to deal with, which is that an enormous amount of our language is false. Many things that we call things are not those things. And we just sort of take it for granted that we're supposed to play along. And, we go through this sort of shallow, don't dig too deep because it can't actually withstand scrutiny approach to language. And so he's trying to both say that that's happening and come up with a way of writing that writes around all of those errors that are built into our language to prevent us from understanding things. And
Rick,
yeah,
can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Terry.
Hi. The great point. I'm reminded of Wittgenstein's Turn from his first piece and then his philosophical investigations. I got the impression that he recognized that there was a lot more in language games than we were giving appreciation to.
Yes, exactly. If we just take, go ahead.
It seems hi.
Hi, yeah.
Hey. Language has at least two functions. One is connote a meaning, and the other is for communication. So a lot of the words today lost their original meaning, but they are used to communicate still very well.
Yes.
Okay, so like all those filler words, this and this, doesn't mean you know.
Which is the point of this essay.
Right. And the four-letter word that starts with F usually doesn't mean sexual intercourse when people use it in general language.
Right.
But yeah, for exclamation. So what some writers understand, well, it has been exploited by PR. PR knows that while we use this word not for the meaning, but for communication, subconsciously, there is still a relationship to the original.
Yes.
So without knowing, we are slipped meanings. And if it is just saying, asking for a friend. But the meaning is still there, except it's subconscious. So under the radar, it gets into us and contaminates a lot of knowledge and understanding that we think we have.
Yes.
And in politics, do we kind of speak to that phenomena and call it dog whistle?
Right. That's an example of the issue where you mean something different from what you're saying, and what you mean is designed to, motivate people, to activate them through their limbic system instead of to communicate with them.
Yeah, Kierkegaard was fascinated with the concept of irony. And his first piece, as I understand it, his first writings dealt with irony. And he realized that in communication, it is an interesting concept, one that we don't always appreciate.
Yeah. One of the things that doesn't come across until you are comfortable with Kenneth's style is that he's a funny guy, and he thinks a lot of this stuff is hilarious. He writes in a way that feels antagonistic and attacking, but it's playful, like a mischievous kid. You got to see a grin on his face when you read this stuff. And one of the places that you can see that, I'm just going to read from one of the paragraphs about a third of the way through the first part, just 4 sentences here. So bear with me. In modernity, knowledge is power, quote unquote. And to get people to misconceptualize and miscategorize their social matrix is truly the foundation of all power over their pathetic mentalities. going to pause here and say, and by pathetic, he's not insulting. He means pathos. He means when a mentality is a symptom of its culture rather than an independent, free thinking thing. This is a technical term. Kierkegaard's anecdote about the farmer who tried to sell his broken down old nag as if she were a cow, even being willing to apologize for the fact that she wasn't much of a cow, is apt almost everywhere. The problem wasn't that she wasn't a, quote, very good, quote, cow, or Christian, or capitalist, or communist, or Democrat, or Republican, or individual, or professional, etc. The problem was she wasn't a cow at all. Calling things by their right names is the prime root of all truth and clarity, all critical resistance to domination via ideology. And so, he's bringing up this funny story because on the one hand, these are serious issues, but on the other hand, it is hilarious that we manage to get so confused that we call things by what we believe them to be or what we have been habituated to refer to them as rather than what they truly are. And then to react as though they are the thing that we called them when they're clearly not. That's not a cow. That's a horse.
So Kierkegaard was the original gaslighter?
Kierkegaard's criticizing gaslighting, right? He's saying, knock it off. That is not a cow.
I mean, he wrote in 1830 or something like that. That was way ahead of the movie.
Yeah, right. So, when people are, this is part of what's so screwed up about American politics is almost nothing is what we call it. Are conservatives actually conservative? Are liberals actually liberal? Or Democrat? Just almost every line and label in here is a mess, and that's not an accident, right? That's his point here. So knowledge is power means that if people want to have power over you, they need to confuse you, and they do, and they spend a huge amount of money doing it. It's part of what makes philosophy so hard is the moment we start trying to talk about, well, what is the meaning of existence and what are right and wrong and so forth, we're already in trouble because almost every word that comes out of our mouth isn't the right word. And even if it were the right word, it's not the right category of terminology. We're like, we misconstrue the basic questions that we start out with as our premises. I don't know if you can see that in this essay, but it's one of his dominant themes. For those who didn't read the whole thing, at the end of part 2 is the original newspaper article that motivated him to write parts 1 and the rest of part 2. And it's about, this was from some time ago, so what, 2003, 2006, somewhere in there. Yeah, 2006. And so this is talking about one of the breakthroughs that's been happening in the last couple of decades, which is gradually coming to understand that germs aren't inherently bad, which used to be the position, like in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, the position was germs are bad. If we could kill all the germs, we'd all be happy and healthy. And scientists knew that wasn't the case, but in popular culture, we had been sold this paranoia and this fear and terror of, oh my God, the germs are going to get us. After the flu, after polio, after all these horrible infectious diseases, we were terrified of germs. And to get us turned around on that, to understand that most of the cells in our body, more than half of the cells in our body, are not us. More than half the cells in our body are these bacteria and archaea in our digestive system, without which we would starve to death, and who modulate, our nutrition and our mood and our propensity to other diseases and all kinds of things. This took a lot of work. Scientists worked on this decade after decade to get us to stop being terrified of germs and to start to understand that without our intestinal flora, we'd be doomed. But Kenneth's taking this as an example of showing just how far off base can we be in understanding even the most basic question like, who am I? Well, I'm this enormous ecosystem is what I am, right?
We are colonies.
Yeah. And it's a delicate balance, right? We have to relate well to it. We can't impose ourselves on our gut flora. If we just say, well, I've decided that I only like this one species, I'm going to wipe the rest of you out, we'll probably die. It's like we really need our flora. We are dependent upon them. It's a symbiosis.
I think also, though, when you talked about the terror of the germs and stuff like that, that's the story that we're drawn to. We need the enemy. We need that. And that's sort of like the seduction, that happens,
Yes.
and that's the story, that I think he's talking about and criticizing, is like how ingrained these little stories are that drag us along, and that we never kind of look at them and think, why is that so attractive? Even
Right.
though it's terrifying, we're just drawn to it, because that's the news, we're just drawn to it. And we're drawn to a story that's kind of known, rather than kind of like, being able to enter into like that we don't know what it is, and that's kind of like my take on the whole story and why he's doing that and stuff.
No, that's right on the money. Yeah. He's talking about the way in which we take for granted the things that we want and that we find attractive and that we find interesting, but those things are cultivated in us. Our culture teaches us what we're supposed to take an interest in, and it tells us stories when we're little kids that then stick with us for the rest of our lives. So the idea that each of us is not an individual but is a really sophisticated ecosystem of members who all have to work very well together in harmony for us to be healthy is not what we teach little kids, or not in the 50s and 60s anyway, right? What we were teaching little kids is you're an individual, you're a monad, you have to keep yourself pure and safe from contamination from the outside. And this same germophobia, Kenneth Smith links it to terror of immigration. And how easy is it to get us talking about those filthy outsiders bringing their diseases and their terrorism and their crime and this whole thing is just building another layer upon the xenophobia and purity culture that we're inculcated with when we're little, and we don't question it because we take it for granted. It's just that's the basal emotional metabolism that's been cultivated in us to make us easy to manipulate.
Well,
But I think
it's okay. I'll say something.
Please.
Yeah, a neuropsychologist came to the conclusion that it's inevitable, Rick, that we have also multiple neural systems in the brain. You can call them different brains, and very few of them really talk to each other. Talk to each other are those that are conscious, and they have a language. But most of our brain is subconscious, and a lot of stuff, and you see that a lot of stuff is happening, taking care of our body right now, through messaging, a very intricate messaging system, such as the metabolism, very sophisticated. So there is a brain there. There are brains that regulate that and talk to each other, but not in language, but in chemicals. Sometimes we have subconscious systems that talk to each other in visuals. And we have very little access to them, but there is such a need for survival, for a unified and continuous identity, that we have created the I.
Yes.
So the I actually, so neuropsychologists that do fMRI kind of look at the brain are wondering, have been wondering for a long time, where does the I come from? What is it? And Gazzaniga, a researcher, a neuropsych researcher, found out that there is one brain system, a neural system, that runs amok around the brain all the time, trying to pick up, pieces of information from different brains, and then kind of reconstruct the whole thing, and comes up front as the speaker of the house and presents as the I, as the self.
Yes.
Capital S. So, but we can't escape it. We have to, because without seeing ourselves as one unified and continuous across time identity, how would we go from A to B? Now, who wants to get through the door today? Which one of you?
Shall we have a meal?
So it's that simple. We need to have only one voice, which is dominant, and that's how we do also with selecting stimuli from the outside. We can't have multiple ones of similar status, so we have to have one dominant, and all the rest go to the background, so we can map our way, so we can have a direction. Otherwise, we are just a ball of energy
Yes.
in a colony. But you mentioned the immigration as one. And then what we see that a lot of our needs to understand us are projected, right? Are projected. So I don't know, I think I sent you one of my performances with the shadow. Some see it as I look at my shadow and I see it as something external to me. And this is how we pick up not just enemies, but we categorize humans to different races, to different religions, different this and that, genders, as if this is something very meaningful. We are all the same kind of shtick. So, but it's this need of the self, of the I, to have boundaries, distinction. I don't think we can get away from that other than to have the awareness sometimes of what we are doing and manage it somehow without getting into too much trouble.
I think you're right, and what you just said puts the finger on what Kenneth's after here, which is it's one thing to project an I unconsciously and in an unexamined way, and to assume that that's the nature of identity. It's something else to project an I with an understanding that it's a role that we're playing, and that we have choices about what we can do, and that we are part of larger things, and that we're made up of smaller things, that we're not a monad, we're part of a system, and that we need that whole system in order to support the continued role that we're playing, and saying, sure, let's be I for now.
So I think it's, there are different eyes. And the problem is, with this, cohesive I character, it immediately kind of takes in, the cultural kind of overlay, what it's there. And it kind of like, that's safe and stuff. So like, when we were talking before about the terrorizing thing, I think in a way that's also speaking, and it's actually a good thing, because it's saying that, in a Nietzsche kind of way, that the horrendous, the horrible, that we all are, that the world is also present. And it's also calling us to kind of engage that, but instead we keep like the same story. Oh, it's bad and we want to keep it away. Well, maybe it isn't bad at all, or maybe, it's part of the whole that's us and that it isn't to keep, an I, meaning the same I, but like in a Nietzsche way, like the different things, one might be dominant, but it switches. And then something else can be dominant as long as they allow all of them, or at least the majority of the forces to kind of have their play.
Yeah, that's right. Sharon.
I came at this very different concept.
Good. Go ahead.
I mean, non-philosophical. I understand all the little helpers. Can you hear me?
Well, yeah, a little bit.
All right, 1 second. Let me just put my headpiece. I understand that all the little helpers in the gut. Excuse me. Yes, I understand that all the little helpers in the gut are part of the whole. All the little helpers in the mouth, in the armpit, all the germs. That's what makes us function well. And in fact, the entire human being is one big symbiosis. So for me, it was fascinating to see him take this extremely scientific concept and extrapolate it to social, political, and the being and your psychological being. And that's what I am learning from all of this. Now,
Yeah.
when those bacteria get upset, those colonies, that's when we get ill. If you sterilize the gut, you become very, very sick. So it's like it's a critical part of our essence. And
Yes.
interesting to see the philosophical distillation of all of this.
Yes. Yeah, there's a great deal of rich metaphors here for our role in life and in the world that that used to be, even though the Greeks didn't know about microbes, they still saw the relationship of the individual to nature and to other people in that same kind of sense. That we're part of a much larger whole of things that are flowing and changing, that every individual is changing from moment to moment. You've probably heard the Heraclitus statement, you can't step in the same river twice.
Yes.
There's a corollary that's also from either Heraclitus or one of his followers that says, it's not just because other waters and still other waters are flowing, but it's also because I step and do not step. I am and I am not at the same time. I myself am also a river. I'm also changing from one moment to the next. And stepping into the river for the very first time is a different experience from stepping in it the second time. And the I who approaches the river the second time isn't the same person. I've been altered. So there's this kind of deeper stuff in there that even though they didn't know about microbes, you can sort of see this idea that, as part of a community and as part of nature, we're constantly flowing and shifting. And it moves away from the idea of a sort of a perfect, sterile, unchanging I, which is the fallacy that we slip into when we do it unconsciously, when we don't do it consciously, as Ayala says.
One of the self-improvement people that I like to follow once said that somebody asked him, if I get involved with your stuff, will your stuff change my life? And you know what his answer was?
What was his answer?
His answer was, you're always changing.
Yes.
You're different today than you were yesterday. You're different
Yes.
this week than you were last week. You're
Yes.
different now than you were this morning. You're changing continuously. Everything changes your life.
Yeah, and sort of a saying from the hermeneutics is you never read the same book twice.
Right. That applies as well.
The second time you read it, you bring to it what you learned from the first reading and you see a different book. So I think that was the idea that was being thrown about with the never step in the same river twice, is that you never have the same experience twice because of the what has been learned. In this discussion, I did want to throw out a kind of a question. I personally am fond of affect theory, and I come at that attempting to answer Wittgenstein's posit that there isn't a private language. That was in Philosophical Investigations. He did not hold that there was a private language that we ourselves have with ourselves. And I kind of push back against that humbly with the concept of affect theory. And Heidegger brings in affect as one way for figuring out that which is important to us or that which matters to us, is that below the surface, we can, ourselves, the I will speak to us from below the surface. You can call it subconscious or other, with affects, is flushing of the skin, or why am I so defensive when so-and-so does this, or why is it my mother can push my buttons? And I don't mean to pick on mothers, fathers too, but so I know the discussions may be more anatomical today, but there is this idea that we can listen to the affects that well up within us, and they can be informative. So anyway.
Right. And also that the affects change, they're a perfect example of something that changed. They're very quick, affects are boom, 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 at least in my perception. Here's something like about the stomach. I think I've heard that there's, so many nerve endings in the stomach, only second to the brain. And, and I think that we take that to be, oh, they're just receiving information and sending it to the brain. Well, maybe that's not the case. Maybe they're just like the neuronal, the brain things. And there's a communication. There's a dialogue going on with the stomach nerves and the bacteria. And something's happening there, but we're so oblivious to it because we're just like, we're listening to the rock music in our head and we can't hear something else that's going on. And I think that kind of, speaks in a way to that affect thing, because it's a different form of listening. It's breaking the paradigm of what one's awareness is focused upon.
Yeah, there's a couple of themes here that run through this essay that touch on what you're talking about here. One of them is he talks about familiarity and taking for granted, and the ways in which when we slip into one of these abstract roles about what our job is in society, what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to relate to each other, it's easy to forget that it's only a role, it's only an abstraction, and that if we focus too much on that abstraction, we lose touch with who we really are and who other people really are, and what the natural world around us really is. That there is this need when we engage in these abstractions to not become uprooted and lose track of the more complex, mysterious picture underneath. So, like you say, there's all these affects flowing through us, trying to tell us things. But if we make a habit of over intellectualizing, like I did when I was younger, it's easy to go through a whole day and be completely out of touch with what you're feeling. Even, I used to have days where I would work all day and I'd get to the end and realized I hadn't eaten anything because I didn't notice, because I was so into the intellectual things that I was doing. And that's bad for your body. And it's also bad for having a healthy sense of self, because you become disconnected from the things that are actually required to live. So invested in this higher order, but really more abstract a way of living, that we detach from the tangible things that are required. So that's what happens with the sense of the I. Who am I? Is we slip into the abstract role and we stop listening. And when we stop listening, we stop getting all this information that's constantly available to us if we can just pay attention, if we can remember that it's there and that it's always shifting and trying to tell us things.
So I like the term that you used before, Rick, and Sharon also spoke about the ecosystem idea. An ecosystem, it's like a house of cards. You take one card somewhere and the whole system changes, sometimes collapses. But go back to, and I think this is not just about the individual organism, but in general, what we are doing to the planet. And one of the problems that we are encountering now is that one thing that we see as the biggest advantage over any other life form there is on the planet, and that is our consciousness, or our frontal cortex, our ability to think about our thinking and to be, we call it intelligence. And with it come what we call the ego, which is my thinking about how you think about my thinking. And that's, those are, I find in these times, our biggest saboteurs. You know, we got so much, because the conscious now doesn't still have an awareness of all the subconscious systems that we have. And other animals, other life forms, just do what they do. Their subconscious takes care of their survival and their faring, and they don't worry much about that. They don't try to change their environment. They change themselves, like, you know, now it's cold. So my cats didn't manipulate electricity. They don't know how to provide a warmer climate. What they do is they fluff their fur, and they look for a warm place to snuggle in. But we feel that because we don't know the subconscious systems, what motivates, we make stories. We reconstruct reality all the time. We reconstruct ourselves and our self-image, and reconstruct reality in our mind, and we try to dominate it, as if we can dominate the ecosystem by taking a few pieces here, putting them there, changing their use or their function, and we got to a point now with the climate that and the pandemic that we see our shortcoming. We can't do that.
Yeah, there's rich stuff here. You know, a lot of this is captured back at the Oracle at Delphi, when, you know, at the Temple of Apollo is inscribed, "Know thyself, know thyself," and part of the reason for that is to humble a human being who might approach the Oracle in arrogance, and remind us that we can't even answer the first question. We don't even know ourselves the way that, you know, the Oracle, you know, is the Oracle supposedly channeling Apollo, and Apollo as a god of enlightenment knows himself in a way that's impossible for us, and that we have to recognize that we have this problem that's fundamental to our nature that we have to struggle with, and not just take it for granted, but really lifelong work at this problem in order to aspire to be something better than what we start out as. And yet, even though it's there as this fundamental puzzle that reveals part of the nature of the limitations of being mortal, people just gloss it over and look away from it and say, "No, I'm me. It's easy. The end. I know who I am," they say, even though they don't know who they are. You know, one of the great limitations of formal logic, it's great, in some ways it's Achilles' heel, its great weakness is, if your propositions that you begin with are flawed, it doesn't matter how good your subsequent logic is. Right? Fruit of the poison tree. Everything that follows is going to be broken and distorted. And, you know, where do we begin with? We don't even know who we are, who's doing the observation of the world and of ourselves and of others. We have this deep warpage right at the get-go before we say our first sentence. And if we acknowledge that, then we can imperfectly stumble our way together and help each other towards the truth. But if we don't acknowledge it, if we model ourselves as though we're a monad with objective vision that sees reality as it actually is, then what we're going to do is glue into place all of our distortions. We're going to cement them in as things that we can't question and that we won't let anybody else question. So you can see why the Oracle is saying, if you want to get wise, your very first step is learn to shake up your assumptions about yourself and how you see the world. And from there, other truths might become possible. But if you can't even do that, it doesn't really matter what else you do.
And I think it's like the know yourself, you know, it's like a paradox. It pretends that it's an accumulative thing, but it's not. It's a deconstructive kind of thing, because to be in reality is to be in experience. And the only way to be in experience is to let go of a sense of self that denies one as the wholeness of what the experience is.
Yes, that's right.
Let me go back to something you said.
Please,
Rick.
Will.
So there's this very obvious theme about the body and the multitude of things that make ourselves up and then the accumulation of that in the self. But just follow me along here for a second.
Yeah.
So you were talking about how there's this like balance or difference between intellectualizing things and then just like the natural expression of them, like thinking about, I don't know, the philosophy of food all day, or whatever your anecdote was when you were younger, instead of actually eating anything, or like, I don't know, practicing food meditation and trying to feel it or understand it instead of just eating it, or so, you know. But I think that you were just about to hit a point that I'm struggling with right now.
Yeah.
So to understand like the self and the other, like those things that are alien to us versus ourselves, that is an inherently intellectual thing. And I think one of the reasons why it's difficult for humans to do that is because we've reached the point where we can understand what's apart from ourselves, but we're still grappling with the things that have worked for us in the past, right? So if you were in a natural environment, anything that was outside of you was potentially dangerous. And if you had food, I wasn't alive back then, I'm assuming that things would have gone better for you if you just were careful, extremely careful of anything that didn't look like you or something like that. And I'm wondering if this is where the metaphor breaks down, that instead of getting in tune with the things that make us up, right, or like what's worked for us in the past, like this idea that we're just an amalgamation of many different things and we should just embrace the natural qualities of that. And but one step further than that, right, it's an inherently intellectual thing that you have to do to like categorize those things into good and bad sections and try to let other things in, because otherwise it's just, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, it can be come at from multiple angles. It can be come at intellectually, but it can also be come at emotionally, because after all, the self versus other is central to the limbic system. The 4 F's of the limbic system, so called. These drives to flee or to fight or to feed or to get it on are about the relationship of the self to the other, and are we going to react with fear or anger, or affection? It's deep in us, and it's powerful in us. It's a layer of the brain. It's deep in the core. One of the interesting discoveries of neurophysiology is that if you light up any neuron on the outer cortex, it doesn't light up in isolation. It lights up in multiple directions. It lights up, it sends signals to other neurons, and not randomly, but according to really coherent pattern. And one of the patterns is it always lights up through all 5 layers of the cortex, all the way down to the emotional system, to the limbics, to limbic or other, white matter deep at the core of the brain, always lights up. You can't think a thought without having an emotional reaction to that thought. And part of the reason is that the emotions give thoughts their juice. That's how that's how your brain knows which thoughts matter, is the thoughts that you feel something about. Whether you're conscious of feeling it or not is a whole separate question. Because as Ayala says, the unconscious is so vast. Our conscious misses most of what's going on most of the time. But so in the process of doing any intellectual thing, such as trying to sort out, what's helpful and what's harmful and how should we relate to the world, in addition to the cataloging at an abstract level that's going on, we're also having this emotional juice in reaction to every single thought. And that's what's helping our brain prioritize. It's like,
actually, yes, you're right. And the relationship is reciprocal. Sometimes
yes.
Thoughts can trigger that juice, and other times the juice. So it's not a chicken or the egg kind of question. It's just that they are very highly correlated. But I'm noticing is I'm here at Dowdy Till. Are you there?
Hi, Dowdy.
I am here. Yes. I'm
Yeah,
reading.
I see the background. I see Salvador Dali's The Swans.
Yeah, swans imitating elephants.
Right. Well, actually, this is a good example for this talk, which is about the reconstruction, how we reconstruct before even we have thoughts like a full idea. We have perceptions, and if the perceptions, like Rick, I think you mentioned it, if the perception gives you the wrong or a misinformation, I mean, everything else after that is useless. So this particular Salvador Dali, who was adamant about breaking paradigms, cognitive paradigms, and showing you that everything that you think you see is really not what you see, is not reality. But this one especially, if you turn this, what you see is there like four swans on top of the water, and as you look down at the reflection, you see four elephants. However, if you turn the picture upside down, I have one at home, and you look again, you see the water line. You look at those figures on top of the water line, and they still look like swans. And under it, you see the elephants. And what really it shows you is that our expectations, we expect over the water what we expect to see, swans. And so we will always see swans, even if there is only some resemblance is good, but ambiguity can get us completely out of touch with what really is going on in there.
Right. Right. That there's a huge amount of work that happens unconsciously to produce what we take for granted as even simple perceptions. We think we're seeing clearly, objectively, as things are, like some kind of mirror or lens, but actually an enormous amount of brain power went into making us think that we're seeing something just the way that it is. And that's part of why Salvador Dali has such fun with us, is he knows it's not true. And so, like people who specialize in optical illusions, he forces us into boundary cases where we either delight in the discovery that, oh my goodness, there is all this work going on that I wasn't aware of, and I should question my perceptions of the world, or it makes us uncomfortable because if we don't like to be challenged, if we are overly invested in our ego and in our abstract reasoning as the source of truth, then we might rebel against it and go, no, I don't like looking at those things. They make me uncomfortable.
I'll just point out that being aware of all the little things around you is a great first step into total madness. And it's not necessarily the happiest trip you'll get there. Imagine waking up every morning and, taking a full manifest of everything that's in your gut and how it feels. Hello, little intestine. How are you doing today? Hello, large intestine. It wouldn't be fun. And but for all the millions and for all the incalculably large number of atoms that you lay on every single day.
Oh, yeah.
That would be.
If you had to count them,
it would be terrifying. I wouldn't want to live in a world like that. I'm perfectly comfortable up here.
So let me agree with you with a couple of examples. One example is, we take for granted what our flora does with an apple to make it possible for us to live as a result of eating an apple. To show the relative power of the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, if the only way we could digest an apple was consciously doing every step as a decision, we'd starve to death before we finished digesting the first bite. It's just so complex and intricate, we can't even imagine. It's like no computer in the world is fast enough to run through all the calculations in time for us to not starve to death. Our conscious mind and our sense of self is utterly dependent on this enormous complexity of nature that makes it possible. So to start with, I'm with you, right? One of the things that Nietzsche talks about is the Apollonian versus the Dionysian. He talks about them as a mode that your brain can get in. He talks about them as a mentality you could be trapped in lifelong. He talks about them as a mode of a culture that could have an emphasis one way or the other. And the idea of the Apollonian is the idea of enlightenment and reason, and we will make all the decisions with our free will, and there will be nothing that's unconscious and nothing that is traditional. We will choose everything. And you see this like in teenagers or 2-year-olds. You see this in cultures. And the Dionysian is the response to that, which says, "Oh, Apollo." Maybe a deity could do that, but no human being can pull that off. It is not possible for us to ape Apollo and successfully live our lives. We depend upon this vast icebergian bonus of the unconscious that does all this work for us, and we need to not think about that. So two examples to go with that. One is, the folklore about the vampire, not the Hollywood version, but the folklore. One of the ways you can save yourself from the vampire is to throw a bunch of rice on the ground, because he's such a rationalist. He has to stop and count all the grains of rice before he can do anything else. And that's enough for you to get away, because it turns out he'll be at that all night. And if you throw enough out there, you kill the vampire, because he stays out there all night counting rice he doesn't finish before the sun comes up and he dies. And it's to show the limitation of being overly intellectual and insisting on making every decision yourself, is you perish that way. It's as you say, it's a road to madness. You can't actually, the only way to live a sane, healthy life is to accept all of this help from all this unconscious stuff that we can go ahead and let be in the background doing what it's doing. Otherwise, we just wouldn't make it. The other example I like to cite is the difference between a world-class brain surgeon and a medical student who's studying brain surgery for the first time. And who's thinking the most? Who's the most thoughtful in this process? And what's interesting is it's the student who's thinking the most. Because for the student, every single part of the process has to be thought about. It's all new. It all has to be understood. None of it can be taken for granted. None of it's unconscious. And that's why he's terrible at it. Because our conscious mind, when we're learning something, it's so much work just to learn it. We can't actually be good at it yet. It's not until we've gone through it so many times that we drive it out of our conscious mind into our unconscious, and it becomes part of our habits, our repertoire of responses that we don't have to think about, that it becomes possible for somebody to become a world-class brain surgeon. So now most of it comes automatically, and so they can save their conscious mind for the things that are exceptions. Oh, that I see that artery is not where I thought it would be, so I won't make the cut where I normally make it. This is a decision that a world-class brain surgeon can make, because the rest of what's going on is background to him. He can foreground the part that's interesting and different. But a beginner, he's having to think about everything. And so he doesn't, if he goes by rote, he'll kill you. And if he doesn't go by rote, he'll kill you. He doesn't know what he's doing yet. It's too conscious. So, Will, that's my way of agreeing with you a couple different ways with some metaphors.
Yeah, for sure. I would ask, assuming we could be conscious of all the little things, what's the litmus test for being able to tell which ones are important to think about, or which ones are beneficial or negative in any level, from the body to society, in any level?
Well, that's where this gets interesting, because immediately we can see that the problem's too big. The problem's too big. Even just making a list of all the different species of flora in our gut would take all day. And we don't know most of what's in there still. We're still cataloging. It's like scientists all over the world working for decades, and they're still cataloging, right? So what chance do we have even to make the list? So what it shows is the extent to which, although exploring these things is something that we should dip our toes into, over and over throughout our life, we want to learn new things. We can't try to arrange things so that we're dependent upon being done with it. We're always working on a rough draft.
It's a continuous process.
Exactly, Sharon. Iterative, incremental, continuous, right? We're approximating. You remember in the 1980s, it was hip to say that every child is born knowing how to do calculus, because if you throw a ball, they can catch it. And you can only model that curve with calculus. And what came out later is that that's completely false. That that's not how a child does it. A child does it by successive approximation. Oh, my hand's in the wrong place. my hand's a little closer, but it's still in the wrong place. So that feels more or less right. And as it gets closer, they gradually zero in on it. It's the
To be fair, successive approximation is calculus.
Yeah, but they're doing it imprecisely, not precisely.
Oh,
It's a very different approach. They don't know differentials. They don't know integration. They don't know how to do any of that stuff. But what they do know how to do is roughly line up their eye with their hand.
Their eye-hand coordination, yes.
Right, right. Now, if they had to do that by solving calculus equations, which I've done, right? I mean, many of us have taken math at some point. It would take too long. They'd have been hit in the head with the ball before they could ever finish the calculation to figure out where to put their hand. The unconscious is doing this feedback loop of approximations for them. And so consciously, they don't have to do any calculus at all.
Have you heard this story of like this guy who, like, at least during his going into adulthood, like was not known, intellectually to have any outstanding, achievement or anything. And he gets in a bar fight and he gets cracked over the head with a bottle or something like that. And then like the brain damage actually causes him to have this genius math skill. No, like this is true.
I believe you 100%. I do.
No, I know, and he's actually able to see the world like calculus, and that like that delta x as it like basically like goes to like approaches zero. Like he like I can find the link and I'll post it. I also posted this link. It was from a little bit over a year ago from Quantum Magazine on the mathematical model of like what goes on in visual processing and the visual cortex, which is quite interesting. Like we don't like, it's not just like, the photons like hit our retina and then like it kind of, and it goes into our brain.
Right.
There's like these layers and layers of processing, and then they kind of loop over each other.
Yes.
And what is actually low resolution in terms of at receptors at the input basically get through this layers of processing and feedback loops, creates patterns, which then like you get like the output way back like at the end of this thing. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I the thwack on the head, but the reason I laugh so hard is that's a Zen parable. When they're teaching Zen Buddhism, one of the things that they teach is the idea that you should not use your head like an object. You should use it like a head. And that's why a master will thwack you on the head sometimes when you ask a particularly stupid question. It's like, it's like, or when you don't ask a question, you just routinely do something you did before, but you do it in the wrong context and it produces bad results. It's like, see, it's not fun when your head's an object, right? Don't use it that way. The idea that the thwack on the head would actually produce Satori and suddenly I can do advanced math is like, it just lines up with Zen so beautifully.
Yeah, I posted an article link, but he's been interviewed through multiple
oh sure,
venues. Yeah, it's quite interesting. Yeah,
I see Sharon has something to add.
Yeah, so he's able to kind of because he's able to do what people are doing with what mathematicians are doing with equations and stuff like that consciously. Like he's able to just naturally see it. So he's able to kind of bring different insights and stuff. And so like he's even though he doesn't have any formal training, like he's been collaborating with different mathematicians in academia and stuff. So it's quite
Thanks, Richard. Sharon, go ahead.
Well, as I read through these two essays, there was one sentence that, in my mind, summarized the whole thing. And it's in the second essay, and it kind of dovetails with some of the questions that Will's been asking. He says, for humans, may I read it?
Yeah, please.
For humans ever to be cured in any degree from the self-enclosing modern nightmare of encapsulated and isolated life and mentality, humans must become competent to reevaluate their ultimate grounds of existence, the primordial principles, and the purposive energies out of which they live.
Yes.
How do we approach that kind of competence? How do we approach that thinking?
So first of all, I'm completely with you. I think that's the pivotal sentence of this whole essay.
Yes.
You've put your finger
that whole
right on
paragraph was pivotal for me.
And it's central to Kenneth Smith's philosophy overall. I mean, he writes on countless topics, but you find that this sentence you've got here is a strange attractor for all of it. Whether it's applied to ethics or existence or how do we know things, he comes back over and over to this thing of if we to kind of, I'm going to merge Ayala and Will's comments here and say, to actually live life, we have to be able to pull out of all the details, or else we're stuck forever, counting rice or counting microbes and never digesting an apple. But at the same time that that's true, and it is true, it's also true that we have to be able to question the illusion that none of that exists, and that we are just abstract conscious minds, floating in the void, reasoning perfectly and perceiving the world exactly as it is. We have to be able to modulate back and forth between taking for granted the role that we play in life as thinkers and as members of society, while also from time to time, depending on your taste for it, being able to take a step out of that role and to look back at, so who am I really, in the world? What is nature really in the world? To be able to question the things we take for granted without getting lost by doing it. That's the balancing act, right?
Mhm.
To be able to do both things incrementally, iteratively, in successive approximations. There are traps on both sides. The moment that we think that there's no higher abstraction worth living, the moment we get lost in the details, as Will says, then it's all madness. But the moment we get lost in the abstraction and forget about all of the unconscious things that are going on, then that's also madness, even though that's a common madness that we see all around us in society, the taking for granted that we are the abstractions we pretend to be. We've got to be able to do both.
It seems to me that the answer is maybe you call it the non-attachment that Buddhism is talking about, or non-obsessiveness. There is no manual as how to live life. And we are attached to some idea, number 1, 2, 3. We are looking for definite answers, and as a result, very often create what you talked about, Rick, on Facebook a lot, the binary thinking. One or two or two oppositions of either this or that.
Right.
Very, very, very often in life, there is no either one way or another. We are in a gray area, and we have to make decisions along the way all the time as to which way to go. There are a lot of good ways that would be good under one context and not another. One time, not another. And also not all the way. They clash. The world is a mess. And maybe to let go of this need to have certainty. And all I see, to be aware of those microbes, that I'm an ecosystem, is kind of, it was amusing me first when you mentioned it. And live in comfort with what it is, who you are, live in comfort with, as part of nature, not with nature, as part of this awesome, amazing kind of planet. Find amazement in the little things by paying attention to what is available to you. One thing that the inseparateness shouldn't bother us. We have to train ourselves to feel like part of, rather than a separate, and then comes the domination. We want to be on top of this, and the need control, and the need to feel ourselves as the hottest species on Earth. If we are able to free ourselves so we can enjoy what's going on, we will find much more joy in life without all those needs. That's, I see the answer, and how to get there. I don't know. Some people say drugs, psychedelics.
Go ahead, Sharon.
Well, one of the things, I think it's your own personal philosophy, Ayala, because I think in life, if you look at early cultures, they honored the interdependence of living organisms, right? As we got more and more sophisticated, we identified this thing called individualism, And I don't know what the philosophers say about that. But it's counterproductive to who we are. Our entire body is about interdependence. The little microbes in the gut tell us that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting thing about being alive. I don't know if you guys have ever read architect Christopher Alexander. He's famous for writing The Timeless Way of Building and A Pattern Language, which are books that are huge in the IT departments. I'll put his name in here. But I like best some of his most recent books. He's got a 4-volume series called The Nature of Order.
Which what were the titles of those 2 books?
So I'll go ahead and list them here. The Timeless Way of Building is one of them, and it's a criticism of modern architecture by comparing what we build today now in our downtowns with where are the places around the world that we think the architecture is the best, and how did they build, and showing that they all had some things in common that's different from the way we do things. It's a remarkable book that forces us to look at thousands of years of architecture. A second one is called A Pattern Language, and it's an idea for a different way to do design, where rather than starting with a blueprint, you sort of start with what are the problems you're trying to solve and what are the different patterns for solving that problem. And as the patterns gradually grow together, you gradually get a design out of it that's adapted to the specific circumstances instead of being sort of chopped out like a factory creation.
When were they published?
70s, in the 70s. But they really became more famous in the 90s when IT discovered them. The computer people were hugely inspired by this idea of pattern languages and design patterns. It became the rage. But what I want to point us to is his more recent work, the 4-volume series, The Nature of Order, of which volume 1 is The Phenomenon of Life, which is why I'm bringing it up. It's directly relevant to this discussion. Phenomenon of Life, yes, spelling, and there's others. So in it, he tries to tackle the underlying problem that he wasn't able to build a theory or a model for in his earlier books, because he kept coming back over and over to saying there's like a difference between living architecture and dead architecture. And then he kept saying, but that can't be the right words. This can't be about life because life means organisms. So this is about something else. But decade after decade, he kept having a poverty of words to explain it. And so he finally sat down and tried to bang out a theory. And what he's come up with is a geometric theory of life instead of an organismic theory of life that allows him to talk about buildings, even though they're not organisms, in terms of how much or how little life they have. And that's why we react to them positively or negatively. Some buildings we want to go into and we want to explore and we feel alive while we're doing it. And that subjective feeling is not just an idiosyncratic reaction. It is life recognizing life in the same way that people will respond to a beautiful tree in a way very differently than they do to just a cube sitting on a table. There's more to react to, and there's something in us that's drawn towards it. And he's trying to get at, well, why is that? Why is this not just a subjective reaction? Why does everybody respond this way unless they've been trained out of it? And so what he comes up with is a list of, 16 different geometric characteristics of living systems, setting aside, biochemistry, cellular anatomy, and all that stuff, just setting it aside, just looking at it as a math problem, as geometry. You can tell if you're looking at a living system, because living systems organize themselves in certain ways and relate to other things in certain ways. So here's what I'm getting at. The thing that I want to extract, I shared it in the chat. You can look up the books for yourself. And let me tell you, they're full of pictures. I mean, oh my God, they're just illustrations cover to cover. The Phenomenon of Life is a heavy, heavy book because of all the ink of these full color and black and white photos that they're just run from beginning to end, so that he can show you pictures of what he's talking about. One of the fundamental things about being alive geometrically is that you are composed of other living things, right? Other living things are part of you, and they create you through their actions. That's why you exist as a whole, is because of their actions. But in addition, to be alive is to be, along with a whole bunch of other living things, part of systems that make up a larger whole. You're not just a whole. there is an overlap of the many holes within you that make up a whole that is you. And then you plus a lot of other holes make up some larger whole. And both of those things have to be true for you to be a living system. So if you get too caught up in Kantian Cartesian monadism, the idea of the self as a self-sufficient individual, you miss out on the fact that that would be dead. If you are merely self-sufficient, then you can't possibly be alive. The only way you could be alive is if there's a whole bunch of you, and you also make up something larger as well. That's one of the just checkbox tests for life. And it reminds me of the way biologists say there's no such thing as a species made up of a single individual, because it takes a whole bunch of members for the species to be sustainable.
You know, it's hard for us to understand, not saying I have in me other kind of life microbes. I'm a colony. The whole I mean, there is only one colony that it consists of very different systems, but there is no homunculus here that is the I, you know, dominating it or having any particular function that is separated from the rest of the colony. And you're right, this interdependence, I think it's not maddening, Will, to think about that. In fact, it's kind of, for me, it's kind of reassuring. You know, your homunculus is not alone. And if many times, if we just leave things alone and not try to fight off, in many ways, you just want, like anxiety attack is an attempt to breathe real fast so we can get enough oxygen. And the harder we try, the worse it gets. But the body knows how to breathe without you having to tell it anything.
Ayala, can I just say that listening to you reminds me very vividly of professors at my liberal arts college. Like right on, like this, like kind of like European theater artsy person talking about like Buddhism and humanity and mindfulness. Very inspiring.
That's great.
A lot of time around.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if it's good or bad what you said.
Very good.
Very good. Very good. Very
Oh,
human, right? Very
Yeah.
human.
It's called old age, Will.
I think there's a thing here where, you know, because any living system exists at least 3 levels, there's our living components and their lives and what they're doing. There's us as a whole made up of those components that has its own life. We're not just the microbes in our gut. We are also something in ourselves that is made up from all of that, and that we can think of ourselves that way. But then there's the 3rd level, which is that we're part of something larger. We and a bunch of others together make up something larger. And all of those wholes matter. So if we're in the middle, the thing that we need to do perspectively to be sane, I think you put your finger on it, right? How can you be healthy? What is your orientation towards all of this complexity, which far exceeds our ability to think it all through rationally? And I think it has to be that we're amphibious in a cognitive way, that we can stay where our default could be thinking of ourselves as an individual. And if it becomes an obsession and that's the only level we can think at, then we've lost our sanity. We've become unhealthy. And to be healthy, we have to be able to modulate out of that and sometimes think of ourselves as the components when we need to, when that's the better fit to the questions that we're asking, and then to be able to return. And then likewise, to be able to modulate up and say, what is the larger ecosystem? What is the larger whole that we're a part of? And then to be able to modulate back again. You know, having a home base, but not being trapped there in a cage, so that we can venture forth and then return, I think is what allows us to feel safe in exploring this complexity without feeling like if we weren't able to explore it all, that we would be in danger. It's like, no, we can always go back to home base. And then when we're ready, then we can go out again.
I'll try to add to that very briefly, but there is this. I think it's a well-known fact in psychology, but it is one of the most defining characteristics of human beings and their capacity to be able to think two incongruent thoughts, two mutually contradictory thoughts at the same time and believe them both at the same time. So it is, I mean, it is possible to be able to live in both of those worlds at the same time. That's all. I just wanted to add to that very briefly.
And I'm going to agree with what you said. One of the ways I want to do that is by saying, the Psych Project, CYC, has been an attempt to come up with artificial intelligence by developing computer systems that they call ontologies, which are systems of meaning. And one of the things right off the bat that they found was a problem that they had to solve is that early attempts to represent artificial intelligence kept trying to make it so that there was only true and false. And that wasn't enough to represent thinking. To represent thinking, we had to do computers had to be taught to do exactly what you're saying. They had to be able to have different contexts within which things were true, but out of that context, they wouldn't be true anymore. So within the context of Lord of the Rings, sure, there's hobbits and orcs and dragons, but within the context of New York City, as we're living in it, not so much with the, orcs and hobbits and dragons. And the ability to modulate back and forth between the two is what made it possible to be healthy and accurate and coherent.
Yeah, it's.
May I say something?
Sure. Hi, Jyoti.
Can you hear me? Hi, Rick. How are you?
Good.
So I wanted to speak to this idea of context, and I think we have context in language too. Like a word.
You're breaking up, Jyoti.
Defined by what's before it and coffee shop. I'm going to step outside. Is this better? No? Is this better?
Yeah, that's better. Go ahead.
Okay. So what I wanted to say is that there's context in language too, the language that we've created as human beings. A word is means something or is defined by the word that comes before and the word that comes after. The same as, a sentence makes a certain sense depending on what's before it and what's after it. So there's so much to be said about context, as you mentioned. And also the other point, what was the other big all around encompassing word that you used?
Ontology, levels of meaning.
Yeah, the levels of meaning. Oh no, artificial intelligence and how it is learning to, it as in the zeros and ones are learning to navigate the human system. I think we need, and there are softwares out there that are getting close to that, that can understand the dualism of meaning, and represent, like, is that word coming from up here or down here, or where a person is grounded, where they're defensive, where they're aggressive, and what that implies. Like through text, we can't understand. We as humans can't understand, because all we have is understand the totality of what's being expressed, because we only have the words and the screen. We don't even have the voice. So it's like 3 times removed from what naturally we would pick up, what our unconscious would pick up. So there are softwares, they're getting close to a place where, like, the zeros and ones is what I call artificial intelligence, or computers can have come close to understanding not only intellect, but I don't know feelings, somatic, how you, because that's a lot that the unconscious picks up. It's like, how are you standing? How are you sitting? Where are your hands moving? Are you talking really fast? Is talking really fast, or is really anxious?
What's the context?
Yeah, the tone of your voice gives you so much information just when you say hello.
Yeah.
So I'm surprised at how, like from the work of Kelman and the work of, who's the other person that's really got this down? Gosh, my memory escapes. It'll come back to me. But they have explored a lot about context and the in-betweenness. And I think the same applies to microbes that, are inhabiting us, and we might call them parasites, or we may call them something that's sustaining us.
Symbiotes.
Yeah, symbiotes, you could say the same thing. You could say the same thing about fetuses, they take all the mother's energy
Well,
to
No,
grow.
those are parasites.
Those are total parasites, aren't they? And it takes a whole 18 years for that casserole to cook and, get out of that door.
I like your optimism.
Trust me, I have an 18-year-old and I'm like, come on, out you go.
Yeah, they're horrible. Well,
So-
the thing about artificial intelligence and machine learning is that, and I think this is important for everybody to know, is that just as a point of like scientific literacy, is that we're not teaching computers how to think on our own terms. The algorithms are all about giving the computer its own resources to do that. And it, in a lot of ways, demonstrates the edge of understanding. These are not things that humans can understand how to do. We can see the final product, but they will never make sense to us. We mentally, they just doesn't click in our heads how these computers, in so many cases, end up figuring things out.
Yeah. Well, we're not based on ones and zeros.
Yeah.
The whole, all the levels of structure of information that a computer uses, it's its own line of development.
Exactly. And in a lot of ways, it's because this is a function of an independent system that has emergent properties that we are not familiar with. I mean,
That's right.
we are human biology is its own emergent property of evolution.
Right. Right.
And we're not going to expect computers or other life forms to understand exactly what we are. We shouldn't. And, understanding how computers do things is a dangerous thing, because it's a little bit like trying to understand how submarines swim.
It's just like a bad metaphor, right?
Yeah, it's not the same. The computers don't think. They might be able to reason or learn, but they don't think. And they certainly don't think in the same way
They
we
calculate.
Yeah. So what I'm
Yeah.
talking about is not so much them thinking, but what I'm talking about is them being able to, us programming them in the context of language to be able to refer or give us more information about the unconscious that we can't pick up because we're not in person. Like there's only so much information I can pick up about Rick right now because he's on Zoom. If he was sitting in front of me at a table,
Right.
the amount of information would be exponentially more.
Right.
But these are tools that, especially in this world that's so has become so language dependent. I mean, not language, but typing or letter dependent. Those could really assist in the part that we as humans can't quote unquote see, or the metaphors, or like we talk in metaphors.
Right.
And I've seen programs that can identify those for you,
Right.
and give you a little bit more subtle understanding of where the person is
Yeah, what
at
you're
that
talking about
particular
here,
time.
the language issue that you're putting your finger on here is so important, and it goes beautifully with what Ayala and Will were talking about earlier on this call. That this is that thing we see where two people may get along beautifully when they're face to face, and then maybe not quite so well over a video call or a phone call, and then maybe not at all over email. And the reason is that all of that unconscious information of communication that was present when you could be in the same room and see each other is missing now. So you don't know if they're bored or interested or hostile or friendly. It's all gone. And all you're left with is this little chain of words that somehow is supposed to take the place of all that rich unconscious communication that was happening before. When we pull all the unconscious communication away and are left with only the conscious communication, we get flame wars all over the internet. The people get enraged at each other and don't even know that they agree, because they just assumed from misreading the tone of the message that the other person meant something different. So this is that issue that Jody's talking
But
about with
just
AIs.
one thing, Rick, the tone is not coming
Exactly
from the person that's reading it. I mean, the tone is coming from the person reading it, not the
Right.
person writing it.
But they assume it's
that's a
coming from the
huge-
writer.
Exactly.
They're
So they get-
projecting
that
a
gets-
tone.
Mhm. The projection
Right.
is really, really important. So
Yeah, that's right. Because the string of characters alone is not a complete communication, and the brain fills in the missing parts and doesn't even know that it's doing it. It thinks that it's reading a complete accurate message when actually it was filling in a message. So you read the same sentence when you're angry or when you're happy, and you might think the other guy is angry or happy. You don't know that it was you just filling in the gaps.
Though I
Yeah.
think that's also happens even if you're with the person. It's
Oh,
still
sure.
going on. It's just more obvious at that point. So it's a kind of a learning thing that one does that. One makes the projections. One is doing that, even though one thinks, they're just reading the other person.
Exactly. Go ahead, Sharon.
Because I'm very concrete, all caps means you're angry.
Right? And how often do you get a new person on a computer who doesn't know that, and they're typing in all caps, and everyone says, "Stop it, stop shouting," and they're going, "What? I'm just typing."
Yes.
Right? Context is everything, right? Information out of context is noise. And so if we aren't given enough context, we supply the rest of the context, even if it wasn't what was meant.
just a quick example about all caps. My father, immigrated here when he was an adult, in his 30s or so. I was little, but because he learned typing when he came here, it was so much easier for him to type in all caps than have, I gotta capitalize the first. But everybody now thinks he's yelling, but that's just what's easiest for him to do. So all caps means different things to different people.
I mean, I personally only write in all caps.
No, Will, no.
Yes.
I don't type in all caps, but my handwriting is all caps.
Oh, that's okay then. So, there's this thing. If we understand how much of our thinking is unconscious and how much of our communication is unconscious, how much of our interpretation of our perceptions is unconscious, then we can hold our opinions about what's going on with, a certain amount of humility and sense of humor, right? And recognize that we don't have a perfect grasp of everything. And that's okay. When we spot errors, we're like, okay, cool, an error, I'll just fix it and move on. But if we get lured into thinking that our role is to be perfect and that we're pure intellect and that we see things the way they really are, and a lot of people fall into this mode of thinking about who they are and how they see the world, then when somebody points out an error, it comes across as a challenge. You're claiming that the person is polluted, that they're impure, and they get enraged because you're challenging their entire worldview and sense of self. You see this all the time in politics, just like relentlessly. But you even see it outside of politics. Like in everyday life, people who are still trapped in the I am a perfect monad of intellect and I see things the way they are. How dare you say I might have made a mistake? What they've done from a Greek perspective is they've deified themselves without realizing it. And they're
right.
claiming an authority that they shouldn't be claiming.
It's grandiose thinking, right? Two comments about what you said, all of you. As far as what Will was trying to explain, something that, like in computer, is called genetic programming, where you can start a program, but then the program takes for itself, and you cannot predict it. It will lead you just like natural selection works. This is the idea in evolution, that something is not created with the end in mind as a purpose, but it has a life of itself. And this is what people are very afraid of AI. They're afraid that the robots are going to become so giant and so powerful that they will keep us on a leash like their pets at best. But this is a humbling experience. This is good to keep in mind, again, against this grandiose thinking that, or deified, like Eric, you mentioned, and that is, no, we don't we can't predict everything. There is randomness, and there are chance factors, and which will make us maybe a little less judgmental about different positions that other people are compared to us, because chance and randomness are there whether you like it or not. We won't be able to control it, so better accept it and live with it. And the other thought had to do with the whole idea of that you mentioned, Rick, and that is how to get access to you call it unconscious, but today we use the word subconscious, because the unconscious is like the Terry Schiavo state, the full coma. But subconscious are all the systems that are not accessible to us directly, but we can infer. So when you talked, GOT, about the tone of a person, that will tell you something of their hidden motivation, or how they really feel, even if they don't know it, or the slip of tongue, when we say something that we didn't really mean to say, or free associations, those projective ways that can give us a glimpse. But basically, we can't have direct view of our subconscious systems. And the computers are not going to help us do that. They can count the number of blood cells in the blood flow of a certain system interaction that is correlated with feeling anxious, or with wanting to do this or that, neurocorrelate. But we will never know what another person or another machine will never know what it's like to have any experience, what it's like to see red. No way, we are stuck.
Yeah, we can only approximate, sort of feel our way towards
It
it.
kind of reminds me
Infer.
Oh, Dowdy.
Oh, yeah, sorry. It kind of reminds I don't know if you've seen Avatar by James Cameron with the blue people, and how they can like sync up to each other by using their tails and like hook into the ecosystem in that way. I would probably say I'm a bit more optimistic in thinking that technology could provide us with a means to sort of generate or mimic the experience of the other. But like that's way far off, and that may get way like sci-fi and futuristic. But I think we can get there. I would also say my whole Ayn Randian worldview of just being this rugged individualist is kind of crashing before my eyes. And now I'm here just like a Russian. That's kind of a joke. I was never Ayn Randian. But it's really nice to hear the idea that we're just like a Russian doll stuck somewhere in the middle, and like it goes inside and outside as well. I would probably say that like the goal of each organism is to try to figure out what part of a whole they are, or like what is the whole that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But also to like, I wanted to speak just really briefly to the madness point. It's really interesting, and I love Kenneth Smith, and we were sort of discussing him at the beginning, because he does come at it with a very almost antagonistic nature. But like the madness is almost like a trifecta in a way. Like it's maddening to go too far on each side of the extreme, right? But it's also maddening if you're like in the center. You do have the ability to go like in and out of yourself and view yourself, but you're looking at all of your I shouldn't say all of your contemporaries, but a large portion of your contemporaries, and then you like turn to yourself and, hey, am I the one walking backwards? So if anybody has sort of any way to reconcile that while still trying to sort of approach life with that openness that is required in order to not lose yourself. And lastly, as somebody who just absolutely loves existential philosophy, oh, one more point. Theseus's ship, when we were talking about the Greeks and sort of like no one can cross the Heraclitus, no one can cross the same river twice. I always sort of see it as Theseus's ship about I'm still the same self, but it's just constantly being recreated while this world around me is being recreated as well. But I think it's like the self can be an integral part. I think we have to have a large part of our mind as sort of like, I don't know what word to use here, but I think the self is really, really important in that regards. Like we can't look too far into the ecosystem, and like we are these individuals that through our actions we do create life, or we continuously create life, and there's no expectations. And I think because there are no expectations, then like I don't know, before I get too far, because I haven't really thought that through. But anyways, I just sort of general opinions on what does that leave the individual when trying to like be a part of the world, are we trying to change the world now that we see it? And then really quickly, I think Rick would be a really good person to ask. Could you give a brief definitions on the Aristoi, the Dunastoi, like the layers
the
that he
Duloi, the
uses?
Banausoi, and the Aristoi?
Yeah, like that Brave New World type stuff.
I'll do that in just a moment. I would first like you to unpack for the rest of the group the story of the ship. I love that story. I love that metaphor, and I want to give you the chance to describe it to folks because it's such a great metaphor. Go ahead, Dowdy.
Oh yeah, no, I don't know if I know like the whole story. I just sort of the idea that if you continuously take boards and put on new boards of a ship, is it still the same ship when you're done? Like so you're like at the same time as you're taking it off, you're putting some on, so it's never like disappeared fully. And I don't know the whole story behind it. I just really like the idea of it as it is.
It's a potent paradox, right? It's I think I can't remember if it was Theseus' ship or if it's the Argo, but one of the Greek ships they used as a metaphor and said, oh, so it's been in a wreck, but it's okay. It's just got a few pieces missing, so we're going to put some new boards on. So now we ask the question, is it still the same ship? It's like, well, I only replaced a few boards. Of course it's the same ship. It's like, yeah, well, now I replace a few of the boards I didn't replace previously, and then a few more, and then a few more, and eventually not a single board is the same. Is it the same ship? And it just goes right to the heart of the question of existence versus change. You know, can we be the same person while also constantly changing? And it's not that there's a good answer or a certain answer. It's that, boy, is this the right question to ask? It's like, this is potent stuff right here. It goes right to the nature of human identity.
I've heard that taken one step further as well. Whereas, like, suppose Theseus's ship was, being replaced board by board to some guy on the coast, and that guy on the coast was at the same time rebuilding Theseus's ship with the original boards.
Nice.
And at that point, which one is Theseus's ship?
Which one is Theseus's ship? I love that, Will. I love it. Now we've got two ships. which one is the real one?
My guess is that Plato will answer, this is the difference between a form and presentations, that it's the idea of the ship.
That's what Plato would say, yeah. He'd say neither of them's the real ship. The real ship is the idea. But, there's also the Heraclitean Aristotelian perspective, which is anti-Platonic, which says we have to embrace change more than that. There is no universe of perfect, unchanging ideals. And so in the universe we actually live in, how do we answer a question like that? And it's like, well, it's less clear how we answer it, but it's more clear that this is the potent question that we have to wrestle with as people.
Yeah, one thing I put in the comments was something that Ayala just said, was that it's the metaphor of the ship, which is, there's so many more aspects to it, like what is ship versus what is board, and also board as in on board a ship. So Kenneth Smith would go crazy with that.
Right. Yeah, this is he'd write essays all over this, wouldn't he?
Yeah, exactly.
I might try to hit him up to do that.
You should.
Yeah, I'll pass on Dowdy's story with Will's kind of amplification. See if we can get him to write an essay about the ship.
Exactly, he would be.
I think he'd
right
love
on
it.
the point there. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to talk about, Ayala's point, was that you were talking about cause and effect. Like if you, work at a certain thing, that it should have a natural effect. And you were mentioning that, there are lots of things that are uncertain in this world. You might have practiced for, a year for a ballet performance, and then at the last minute, the shaft of your ballet shoes just dies while you're doing the performance. So just to link that to Hindu philosophy, that's a very important aspect of Hindu philosophy that many people don't know about. Everybody knows about karma, and karma is cause and effect. It's very linear and very, explainable. So you can find the why of an action. Versus Leela, which many people do not encounter in our Western world, is the concept of that we are all in a fabric, and there's so much that's unexplainable that happens. Your life might be going in a straight line, and you've planned it, you've worked hard at it, and then all of a sudden something happens that we term luck, or we term happenstance, or something like that. But there's a whole concept of that, and it's represented as a fabric with you weave the fabric, and then all of a sudden a bird comes and just runs straight into it, or bops its head and bounces off, or something like that. So I just wanted to bring that up in terms of what little I know of Indian philosophy.
That's great.
In speaking about change, Rick, is that
Hi, Ginny.
Hi, how are you, Professor Marshall? I always enjoy listening to you, as always.
Student Marshall, please, student.
Exactly,
I'm not a professor.
Exactly. But in terms of the concept of change, at most elementary level, when I say elementary, I mean like atomic, whatever. I mean, even talking about the ship, a plank replacing this plank and that plank is at the same ship. But the thing is, everything, whether it's organic, inorganic, even rocks, are changing. It may be the little tiniest particle may have come off that rock from one moment to another, or a cellular change within human beings, for example, from one moment to another. So things are always changing. So when you say, well, is this the same person or same rock? Yes, well, in my opinion, everything is always in perpetual change of some form. So, well, yeah. I mean, what can we say? Is that the same rock? Is that the same cat, or the same flower, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like from moment to moment, we are changing as even each person. Our cells may be going through ever so slight a change in our body. So anyway.
That's right on.
We are saying it because this is what's convenient for us to survive in this world, by reconstructing certain unity that may not be there, but otherwise cognitive mapping would be very, very difficult, if not impossible. by not attributing continuity and unity to objects and people and whatever is around us. But yeah, that's the subjective reconstruction. It's not reality. Yeah.
Yeah, Ginny, this is, you know, you're going to warm my heart when you start quoting Heraclitus at me. You know, all things flow, Ponta Re. He's my favorite philosopher.
I didn't know I was making that kind of a comment.
Yeah. That's Heraclitus all over.
It's just my own perception. You know, I'm not well read in any way, form, as well as you. So it's just my own perception.
Well, your perception, you know, granted that our understanding of the cosmos is flawed and limited. You know, from my flawed, limited perspective of the cosmos, I say, right on, Ginny. Ponta Re is the Greek that Plato used to sum up Heraclitus's philosophy. Ponta means all things, and Re means flow. You know, all things flow. Even things that look like they're not flowing are flowing. If we could just see them at a different time scale, we would realize they were flowing too. And
right.
One of the ways that gets driven home to me is, you know, I live in Seattle and we see Mount Rainier all the time. Mount Rainier is just this vast, incredible, titanic piece of the world. And yet it's only a few thousand years old, right? And I say few in a geological time scale. It's not a million years old. It hasn't been around that long. The Cascades are a reasonably young mountain range. They aren't that old. It looks eternal and timeless, but it just hasn't been there that long. And then you go to the Navajo reservation, where, you know, they have these outcroppings that just, you know, vast stretches of space are flat, and then there's these outcroppings that stick up. And my favorite is what people call shiprock. White people call it shiprock, but the Navajo name for it is rock with wings, Sabet I. And winged rock is this weird black plug sticking up out of the middle of nowhere. And it's got these two black dikes running for many miles off two different directions. It looks like a rock with wings. And what it is the plug from the throat of a volcano, and not from the top, but from almost half a mile under Earth. That's where that plug was. And the entire volcano has eroded away, and so has a half mile of the Earth to get down to the level of this plug sticking up in the middle of nowhere on the Navajo reservation. And I can't remember the exact age. It's like 46 million years old.
Oh my God.
Right? Because volcanoes don't take that long to erupt and rise, but once they're there, they take forever to wear away. And so for a moment, you know, all of a sudden, your perception of time just dilates dramatically as you realize that this plug that used to be under the Earth is orders of magnitude older than Mount Rainier, which dominates the landscape for, you know, the whole state. It's just, it's shocking, the sense of time that suddenly arises. And it forces you to think about the fact that even something as permanent looking as Mount Rainier someday is going to look more like winged rock. It's just going to be this plug, because the rest of it's all going to flow away, and all we're going to be left with is the hard core that was under the Earth. The impermanence of things drove Plato mad, and before him Parmenides, the philosopher who was opposed to Heraclitus, who tried to deny that movement or change was even possible. He tried to make little paradoxes to show that you couldn't say that anything actually ever changed, and that was just a trick of bad perspective.
The Austin Philosophy Group in the Tuesday group just did Parmenides for about 2 months. We just finished that Parmenides. And now we're going to go to Gilbert Ryle. But yeah, the Tuesday Austin group have been doing Parmenides. And yeah.
Yeah, there's a line of
Ginny,
Ayala, you're on mute.
Just a quick question, Ginny. Is the Austin group meeting in person?
We used to, but no.
Not yet. Okay.
Yeah.
Zoom,
but
right?
I was going to say that the way to bridge Parmenides with Heraclitus is that the only constant thing in the cosmos is change.
Yep.
So the concept of change is the only thing that's really permanent and
Right,
constant.
right.
Yeah.
Yep, that's what I said in my comments too, Ayala.
Oh, I didn't.
In the chat,
And
that the
going
only
back
thing
to
constant
community,
is change.
Right, right.
Mhm.
It's
going
very
back to
hard for us humans to tolerate that idea. So, I mean, this is the idea with our mortality, right? And
Mhm.
This is where
that's
the
the way I
amphibious
see it.
mindset helps, right? The amphibious mindset allows us to say, you know, even though all things are changing, they're not changing chaotically and they're not all changing at the same pace. And so some things are changing slowly enough that even though we know they're changing, we can still pretend that they're not changing.
We
For the, you know,
call
we
it
can role play.
transformation, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But
Exactly.
Rick, that's where.
Transform.
Oh, go ahead. That's where I put a note about so I wouldn't forget is fight or flight comes in,
Right.
and how your amygdala works. That, you know, yes, there is change and predictable change. However, when there's unpredictable change is when we go back into our, you know, I don't know, our
Limbic system.
limbic
No.
system or mammalian, like basic mammalian brain. That okay, we got to fight or flight and run, and the amygdala just completely charges up. I just want to share with Ayala especially. I want to share a personal story. I think a lot of you know that I have epilepsy, and one that didn't respond to medication for many years. And it was a horrible journey. But however, last year I got a surgery. Now they can do a laser ablation of just the part of your brain in which the seizure is originating. So it just so happened that mine was originating in the right hippocampus and amygdala. So the neurosurgeon went in there and, did his ablation. All of a sudden, I don't have a right amygdala. I don't have a right hippocampus. But it was so interesting that afterwards, I didn't have any memory or fight or flight instinct. It was like I'm starting again at the age of whatever. I won't share that with you guys. Without any memories of trauma.
Right.
So it was amazing because I'm like, oh my God, I don't have any inhibitions. I can be completely free. I don't have any survival skills or habits that I learned as a child that were holding me back, that were all in my unconscious. It was amazing. I could actually feel that my left amygdala is learning the process of, has no trauma at all, and is learning the process of fight or flight. And, people that saw me would say, you look completely different. And it was like my face had completely, or my body had completely changed from being in constant fight or flight to totally have forgotten it. It was like the somatic structure, the language, everything had changed.
Jody, I have a question for you then. So,
yes, please.
When your brain, before you had the surgery, are you saying only different parts of the brain only did different functions? And now you're saying that after the surgery, your left side of your brain is having to pick up new skills, so to speak.
Well, Ginny, that's only because the right side was the dominant side because I'm right-handed. So my left was the indominant side, and it hadn't been fried as much as the left side. So that's why I was starting from a clean slate on the left side. And
but my question is on with anybody's brain. You have all these different parts of the brain, and different parts of your entire brain has different functions, different jobs. and then when part of your brain that used to do certain function, perform certain functions, no longer perform those functions, then all other parts of your brain comes and pick up and take over the function.
What I know about neuroscience is that certain parts of the brain definitely are responsible for certain aspects,
Okay.
and just like your organs.
Oh,
And so since the seizure originated in my hippocampus, the hippocampus is responsible for a lot of executive functioning. So as time went on, I couldn't do executive functioning anymore. Like before, I used to run a huge business. In the morning, I would get to my table, there'd be like 20 shipments. I'd know within like 15 seconds, oh, I got to do this first, I got to do this second, I got to do this third. But it came to a point where because I wasn't driving, just arranging the driver for my children would take up like 2 hours of my time. I could not do that executive processing at all because my hippocampus was getting fried more and more. So yes, it is very, it is that, different parts of your brain definitely do different things. So that's why they say the frontal cortex takes up to the age of 24 to develop. And that's why children or young adults have such a hard time saying no to things that technically they know are bad for them. However, they have a really hard time saying no. That's the job of the frontal cortex. So that develops slowly, and that's why teenagers do such foolish things, even though technically they're like they know it's going to cause consequences that aren't very good. However, they can't stop themselves. So, and amygdala is basically where all your traumatic or your fight and flight experiences are stored. So the one that's dominant usually stores them. So,
Jyoti, the one response that I had when I heard your story, and thanks for sharing, by the way, is what I had a talk today with my son, who is in his 30s and an artist and filmmaker in Berlin that is trying to he's struggling with our reality today, is compensate, and looks like you are doing a very fine job compensating. And this is all we do in life. We all have some amputations, and the idea is to compensate, do the best with what is available, and exhausted. So
yeah, it was a very, very difficult journey. And I think what held me together was the community and the connections I had. There were many, many times where just even somebody that I didn't know very well, have to just hold my hand and go, okay, I'm going to walk you through this. So,
Part of a larger whole.
yeah.
Yeah. Many times it's that traditional image of, you're going to kindergarten for the first time and your mom holds your hand until you get into the classroom. And that's an unconscious memory or power that you will have for the rest of your life, in a way, because it was embedded in you at that age, in that you're separating yourself from what is integral, just your little world, and then you're entering a completely other world. However, somebody is liaisoning you into that. So thank you, Ayala.
Thank you.
Sharon, you're on mute. You want to come off mute?
Djibouti, thank you very much for sharing that experience. And the question I have, though, I mean, before I retired, I was privileged to have done many of those mapping and many of those ablation of seizure foci in the brain. And one of the questions I have for you, what's the time interval between the procedure and now? And secondly, the central nervous system has a feature that's called plasticity, its ability to regenerate. Have you recovered any function, or have you, or has your function stayed diminished permanently?
You're on mute, Jyoti.
It's been a year since the surgery, and I have not had any seizures since then. And yeah, the plasticity, I feel definitely that there is change happening in the parts that were, because for me, it's very different because the organs are gone. Mm-hmm. The amygdala and the hippocampus are gone. So I have the other side taking over. Mm-hmm. So I think for a long time, there was a part of me that wanted plasticity to work and to heal the right amygdala and the right hippocampus. It was like, okay, come on, I can will myself to grow those cells and fix those 3 or 4, 10 neurons that are causing this. However, it didn't work. But taking the ones that were causing the seizures out has completely regained the functionality that I had in terms of, executive functioning. I could not be part of this group before the surgery because I could not read more than 5 pages, and I'm a reader. I've been reading since I learned to read. I would just swallow up books. That was something so intriguing to me. But I had come to the point where I would read 5 pages and I'd just be like, what? And then I'd go back and read them again. And again, the next day I would forget. And then I would go back and read those 5 pages again. And that was as far as I got. And I felt like I was doing it over and over again. But now, I can read all of Kenneth Smith. I can read, I can read, the writing club books and actually retain it. And not just retain it, but be able to go forward. So I'm a writer, and I stopped writing mini novellas down to short stories, and then down to poetry, because that's all I could sustain in my brain. It was like, okay, it got more and more condensed, but now I can follow a storyline way more. And that's the hippocampus that's able to work now.
You could write a book about these experiences from before, during, and after, and many, many people would want to read it.
Yes, congratulations.
Thank you, Rick.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Yeah, thank you so much. I was blown away by how just total trauma was wiped by getting,
one technical question. Did you do this procedure awake? Did they do the ablation while you were awake? Or you don't remember?
No. They did it while I was I was under anesthesia, but the surgeon did it in an MRI machine. So
I see.
So he could follow the laser. If I go back to him, he'll show me a time lapse of the surgery and show me exactly where. But I was out. There was no way that I would stay in an MRI machine for that long. I would go crazy. So I'd be like, okay, bye, I'm done.
The reason I ask is because in the early days, and I'm an older person, when we first started doing this, patients were awake because it helped with the mapping.
Yeah. But see, I think then they weren't in an MRI machine, right?
No, the
Yeah,
technology
so-
changes. AI is a significant
Exactly.
component of all of this.
Mhm.
Back to the AI.
Yeah, exactly. With the MRI, you don't have to be awake because they can track exactly. Okay. There's a really loud motorcycle taking off. But now with the MRI, the surgeon could, track exactly where the laser was going. So there's technology and change for you.
Yeah, this is fascinating,
yes.
Jyoti. I mean, if you enjoy writing, I'd encourage you to write about the before, during, and after, and what it feels like. So there's no way that anybody else could learn this without going through it or hearing from someone like you. It's something we'd all be interested in. And part of the reason is it really helps us to understand the way in which our sense of self and how we think is actually the result of all these different layers of the mind. It's like you're able to know in a way that most of us will never know what one of those layers does to the way that you feel about the world and think about the world and perceive the world. You have the potential to illuminate everybody else's minds for them by sharing your story of what it's like.
Well, Rick, I'll do it if you edit it for me.
There you go, Rick.
I trust you implicitly. Yeah, if I write it and you edit it,
I will edit it. I'll make a promise. You write it and I'll edit.
take you up on that.
I really think you should, because for one reason, that's a very tricky area of the brain to access. And it's also, and you are a success. I mean, you're up, you're talking, you're able to perceive the changes. So it's worth documenting. Very much so.
Thank you, Sharon. And I would, since you have the information, you already have the experience. It is a very, very difficult part of the brain to access. So it's not, it's like way inside.
Yeah.
So
that's why I'm fascinated by your story.
I know,
because I did this, for 50 years, almost,
Yeah. Well, you guys are my inspiration. So let's see what comes out of it.
Yeah.
Well, fabulous. So, that goes right to the heart of this this entire philosophy seminar today. It's all about the way in which, even though we slip into these kind of simple caricatures of ourselves and our roles in the world as though we're a unitary whole that's not made up of any parts, it's just, we just are ourselves, and it's just that simple. And then the law encourages us to continue that illusion. So does the economy, so do politics. The whole thing is structured around the idea that there is a solitary you and you are making informed decisions on your own, and that nobody's influencing you, and you don't contain any contradictory urges or drives. It's like the actual human being is so much more interesting and complex than the little caricature that we've built our entire society around. It seems like there are huge opportunities for transforming society if we just took the real state of being human into account instead of this trivial little illusion we keep projecting.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you so much, guys. I have to leave.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you as always. Bye-bye.
And thank you, David. I wrote to you in the chat that perhaps our nagging about the Zoom is a compliment as to how much we look forward to this meetup.
I'd like to second that. I'd like to second that because I asked about the Zoom too.
Very much appreciate that.
Thank you, David.
And I really do. I'm learning a lot. As you see, I'm not a philosopher, but I understand some of the concepts.
I would like to point out that, all these they're all one essay. It's just that the LiveJournal blog platform that I'm using has a length limit, so I have to divide it. But it's all one thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's fine. And taking Kenneth Smith in little bites is the right way to take Kenneth Smith, because the whole Kenneth Smith is daunting. There's a
Yes.
lot of material, you
Yes.
know.
Well, they
He's
are
trying
But
to-
huge.
it's an ecosystem, you know, and
It
we
is.
kind of transform from one piece to another.
That's right. That's right. So, all right. Well, maybe David, maybe next week is that first piece of Grace, Fate, and Nemithia. Maybe we do the Hellenic ethos.
I'll figure out how to do it. Well, they're kind of lopsided. They're not all uniform in length, so we'll figure out. Oh, yeah.
Wherever
I'll
you
work
think
on it.
best.
Yeah, I'll work on it.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Thank
Well,
you.
Have a
Thank
great
you
week.
very
Thank you.
much.
bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.